Back to the closing plenary of the National Suicide Prevention Conference 2026. Thank you to everyone who's still here. I hope you had a great lunch break, maybe got a little massage, coffee, lunch, and still connected with each other, which is, of course, the most important thing to continue after this conference ends. Let's get things underway with our final keynote of the week. Dr. Tim Sharp, known to many as Dr. Happy, I'm sure you've come across his work. Dr. Sharp is an internationally recognised leader in mental health and positive psychology with a career spanning academia, clinical practice, executive coaching and business. He's taught at leading universities, founded the Happiness Institute, authored multiple books and is a very familiar voice to many through his speaking and media work. What makes his work particularly powerful is not just his professional expertise, it's the way he brings together science with a deeply personal lived experience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim Sharp.
If that felt a bit uncomfortable to you, imagine what it's like for those of us who stay silent. Silent because of shame, silent because of stigma, silent because of the fear of negative evaluation and potential consequences in our professional and personal lives. Silent because we're afraid others won't understand, and sometimes because we ourselves don't even understand. Silent because we think we're not supposed to feel distressed, because we had a good upbringing, because we're privileged, because we've achieved a lot, because they're sometimes known as Dr. Happy. Because, well, the list of becauses is a very long one, but whatever the specific because, too many of us are silent and struggling. Right now, in this room, there are people who are struggling, or who have at some point in their lives struggled with thoughts of suicide. I know this because I have several degrees in psychology and I can read your minds. But seriously, we know this is true in any room because the stats have shown us it's true. Lifetime prevalence studies have found that a significant proportion of people experience suicidal ideation at some point. But here's the rub. Most will never, ever tell anyone about it. And if I asked you to point them out, even a group of people like you who are highly qualified and highly experienced in this field, I don't, with all due respect, think you'd be able to do it. Because they don't all look the way we expect them to look. They're not always withdrawn. They're not always crying. They're not always isolated. Sometimes they're the most successful person in the room. Sometimes they're the ones making everyone laugh. Sometimes they're the one helping others. Sometimes they're the one on stage. Today, I want to talk a bit about that silence, not just as a concept backed by research, but as something I've lived. Because when I was younger, I tried to end my life more than once. And since then, I've continued to experience suicidal ideation on and off for much of my adult life. For a long time, hardly anyone knew this, partly because I didn't talk about it. In fact, mostly because I didn't talk about it because no one talked about it back then. And partly because, for all intents and purposes, I looked happy and successful. Now, the reality was that I might have been successful by some definitions, but the reality also was that I was hiding behind a fake smile much of the time and coping with alcohol and even other substances. So what the outside world could see was that I was completing university degrees. I was building a successful career. I was in a loving and stable relationship with healthy and wonderful children. I was doing all of the things that on paper suggest someone's doing well, which I guess just goes to show paper's not a great diagnostic tool. This is something I really want to emphasise today. What we see is very often not the whole story. So what do we see? And before I go on, I do want to pause to acknowledge that I'm well aware I'm talking to a room full of people who are experts, whose expertise I highly regard, and who are more than likely very aware of some of the traps and pitfalls of which I speak. And yet we're all human. We all make mistakes. We have blind spots. And as such, despite our best efforts, many of us tend to carry an unhelpfully narrow mental image of what suicidal distress looks like. We imagine someone who's visibly broken. We imagine someone who's obviously hopeless and not coping. We imagine people who are disconnected and lost. And while that is indubitably true at times, it's just as often not true. As some of you would be aware, the research increasingly shows that suicidal ideation exists across a broad spectrum of people, including those who are highly functioning. Large epidemiological studies have shown that many individuals who report suicidal thoughts are employed, in relationships, and even socially engaged, which challenges a very simple but persistent narrative that if someone is doing well, they must be well. And this is where I believe the research of Corey Keyes and others has been incredibly important. I discovered Corey's work many years ago now, and it's not overstating things to say that it fundamentally changed the way I viewed my clients and my own experience. At the risk of oversimplifying, Keyes demonstrated that mental health and mental illness are related but distinct dimensions. So rather than a single line from well to unwell, there are two distinct lines, or two dimensions. For those of you who are still involved in research or who remember their research, it's a 2x2 factorial design, with the two axes being mental health and mental illness. And what this means is you can be high in mental health and low in mental illness, which is what we'd call flourishing. You can have high mental health and high mental illness, which we might call struggling. You could have low mental health and low mental illness, which is a combination referred to as languishing, or have low mental health and high mental illness and be floundering. In fact, Keyes found that many people who would be considered mentally healthy based on functioning still experience significant symptoms of depression and other forms of mental ill health. So the idea that success or achievement or accomplishment equals well-being is quite simply not supported by the data, or not entirely anyway. And yet our stereotypes persist. And this isn't the only common stereotype. We can look at a few more. The visibility bias is where we assume that distress must be observable. We're wired, and I guess to some extent we're taught, to look for certain signs. Tears, withdrawal, obvious struggle. But much of the time, distress is quiet, internal, and carefully concealed. People can be functioning, smiling, even succeeding, while privately struggling to stay afloat. And when we rely only on what we can see, we can miss what matters most. There's also the just world fallacy, which refers to when we believe that if someone has had advantages, they shouldn't suffer in this way. There's a comforting belief that life is somehow fair, that good circumstances protect people from deep pain. So when someone who is successful, loved, or privileged in some way, when they struggle with suicidal thoughts, it just doesn't fit the narrative. But suffering isn't distributed according to fairness or logic. Pain doesn't check your resume before it arrives. And there's also the resilience myth, which we believe that seemingly strong and capable people are somehow protected from suicidal thinking. We often, too often, equate competence with immunity. If someone is high functioning, reliable, the one that others lean on, we assume they're coping. But strength can also mean being very good at carrying a heavy load, often without letting others see the strain. In some cases, those who appear most resilient are the least likely to ask for help. And I guess my personal favourite when it comes to these biases and assumptions is the binary thinking trap, that someone is either okay or not. Now, most of us like clear categories: well or unwell, safe, at risk. But human experience doesn't work like that. People can feel grateful and despairing, connected and alone, hopeful and exhausted, all at once. Suicidal thinking can coexist with outward signs of a good life, which means the question isn't, are they okay? But how okay are they really? I can tell you from decades of professional and personal experience, reality is far messier than many of our assumptions would have us believe. Now, I'm fully aware that none of these are formal diagnoses, but they are useful ways to describe individuals who are present as positive, engaged, and even higher functioning, while internally struggling. And from a psychological perspective, this shouldn't really be that much of a surprise. Many of us humans are exceptionally good at compartmentalising. We do it all the time. You can be in the middle of a great day and still have a thought like, I just don't know if I can keep doing this. And those things can coexist. I've lived that many times in many ways. I can distinctly remember periods of my life when I'd deliver a keynote, which was by all accounts well received, or have a great session with a client, or write a book, or achieve something about which I was proud, and I'd feel a sense of purpose. But then later that evening, sitting alone, I'd feel this heaviness that just didn't match the day at all. There's no obvious trigger, no clear explanation, nothing even remotely rational, but it was just there. And that disconnect between external reality and internal experience is one of the reasons this issue is so easy to miss. And this brings me to one of the most confusing and potentially least discussed aspects of suicidal ideation, which is you can want to live and want to die at the same time. This might seem incongruous, might seem like a contradiction, but for many of us, it's a reality. There are multiple theories that try to explain this by referring to perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness, to defeat and entrapment, to psychache and unbearable psychological pain, all of which are fascinating and potentially useful frameworks. But speaking from a lived experience perspective, I'd like to try and add another layer. You can have all of that and still love your life in many ways, which I have to say is deeply confusing. I've felt this confusion. I've been confused by this confusion, caring deeply about my family, feeling committed to and proud of the work I do, recognising all the good in my life, and there's been so much good, but still at times having thoughts about just not wanting to be here. Now, earlier in my life, these thoughts escalated into action. Later, they've more become something that's ebbed and flowed. But importantly, and it's worth noting, this is where the research strongly supports lived experience. External success doesn't necessarily resolve internal struggle. Why? Well, let me count the ways. Now, this could be a very long list, so I'm just going to give you the short version of some of the more obvious and common processes being hedonic adaptation, something I became particularly familiar with when I moved from clinical psychology into positive psychology. Hedonic adaptation is our mind's tendency to get used to improvements surprisingly quickly. A promotion, a new home, a major achievement. These genuinely lift mood, but often only temporarily. Before long, what once felt exciting just becomes normal, and our expectations recalibrate upward. It's not that the good things stop mattering, it's that they stop feeling as good because they're no longer novel. Without intentional practices like savouring and gratitude, we can end up constantly chasing the next lift, the next high, rather than fully experiencing the one we've already earned. There are also a range of cognitive distortions, but today I want to focus particularly on discounting the positives. Here, the issue isn't the absence of good experiences, it's how those experiences are interpreted. Discounting the positives mean we explain away successes or moments of joy. That didn't really count. Anyone could have done that. It was just luck. Quick show of hands if these sound relatable to anyone in the audience. I'm going to put up 2 hands. But over time, this creates a skewed and distinctly unhelpful internal narrative where negative events feel significant and meaningful while positive ones are minimised and dismissed. The result is a kind of emotional asymmetry. Life may contain plenty of good, but it just doesn't land psychologically. And then, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, there's social comparison, particularly upward comparison. Now, it's natural to evaluate ourselves relative to others. But when that comparison is mostly upward, toward those who seem, at least, to be more successful, happier, or more accomplished, it erodes, significantly erodes satisfaction. Even meaningful accomplishments, even meaningful achievements just feel inadequate if there's always someone doing better. And in today's environment, especially with curated social media, these comparisons are constant but often unrealistic. Upward comparison isn't inherently bad. It can actually motivate, it can inspire growth. But when it becomes the default lens, it shifts attention away from personal progress and toward perceived shortfall. Taken together, these processes can leave someone with a life that is objectively rich in meaning and achievement, yet subjectively lacking in satisfaction. Not because anything is wrong, but because of how our minds adapt and filter and compare. Now, at the risk of sounding immodest, these are areas I've seriously excelled at all my life. In case you're wondering, that's not a good thing. There's strong evidence that people who are high achievers are often less likely to savour success, more likely to constantly and unhelpfully shift the goalposts, more likely to compare themselves unfavourably to others. It's a bit like climbing a mountain, only to realise you've immediately started comparing yourself to someone on a higher mountain, which might for some people at some times be motivating, but which can also and I can attest to this, be utterly soul-destroying. I've done all these things so many times I've lost count. And sadly, I've struggled to learn from my mistakes. Time and time again, I've achieved something meaningful and within minutes shifted to what's next. Or worse, just told myself others have done more. And in those moments, the achievement just doesn't land. There's no real sense of arrival. There's no lasting relief. Which means the gap between how life looks and how it feels can actually widen. And that gap is important. Because the bigger that gap, the harder it can be to talk about. Now, I know for a fact I'm not the only person who's experienced this, who thinks like this. So why is it so hard to see? Well, stigma undoubtedly plays a role, but it's also more complex than that. First, I think there are gaps in training. I know my clinical training, which in most ways was fantastic, was incredibly good, but was woefully lacking in suicide risk assessment. Now, admittedly, my training was several centuries ago, but even when this training has improved, even when it's better now, suicide risk assessment still often relies heavily on disclosure, on observable distress, and on known risk factors. And while these may well matter, they're not always present, or they're not always made known. Particularly, dare I say it, in and by high-functioning individuals. People hide it, and they get very good at it. Research shows that many individuals engage in what's called impression management, actively shaping how others perceive them. And this occurs especially in environments where competence and composure are highly valued. Certain groups are particularly relevant here. Men, for example, are less likely to disclose emotional distress and more likely to externalise it. Professionals and leaders often feel they can't afford to be seen as vulnerable. People in caring roles, psychologists, doctors, carers, etc., may feel they should be the ones helping, not needing help, so they don't speak up. And if you were paying attention then, you might have noticed that I ticked every one of those boxes, which is why I didn't speak up. And I know you've already had one of these speakers at this event, thank you Ian Thorpe, but I became the equivalent of Olympic gold medalist at hiding how I was really feeling. I couldn't blame my friends for not supporting me more, especially in my early days, because I knew it wasn't their fault, because they didn't know. I didn't let them know. Over time, however, silence becomes the norm, something that's further reinforced by our systems, which heavily reward functioning. If you show up, if you deliver, if you perform, if you're seen as okay, you must be okay. I sometimes joke, I'm only half joking, that if you can respond to email in a timely fashion, people assume your mental health must be fine. And as some of you who know me are well aware, I respond to emails in a very timely fashion. But this is not how this works. At least, it's not how it should work. And coming back to something I mentioned earlier, that big, ugly elephant that refuses to leave the room, stigma is still deeply embedded. Now, we've made a lot of progress, there's no doubt about it. But despite progress, many people still associate suicidality with weakness, with instability, with failure. And that perception has its consequences. Research consistently shows that perceived stigma reduces help seeking. So if we want people to speak up more, we have to do more than just encourage them. We have to create environments where it's genuinely safe to do so, where vulnerability doesn't come at a cost, where people aren't thinking, if I say this out loud, what might happen next? Until we address that, we're going to continue to miss people. So where to from here? If we accept, and I don't think I'm necessarily saying anything many of you haven't thought before, but if we accept that suicidal distress is often invisible or disguised, we need to change how we respond. Now, the research on protective factors consistently highlights at least three big things. Connection. We've heard much of that over the last few days. Psychological safety. And the ability to disclose distress. Practically, this means asking better questions. Not just, how are you, but really, how are you doing? And possibly asking more than once. And then, notably, tolerating more complex and messy answers. This can be really hard to do, even for many of us, for many reasons, but we need to resist the urge to fix immediately. Sometimes the most helpful response is simply staying present and normalising messiness, normalising complexity, normalising that it's okay to be grateful and struggling, to be successful and struggling, to be connected and struggling, all at the same time. Now, as I've hinted at for a long time, almost no one knew my story because I didn't tell them. And because there was nothing externally that made it obvious. If anything, I probably reinforced the opposite impression. And I know I'm not alone in that. There are many people inside this room and outside this room, many people who are living this dual reality. Which is why I think conversations like this really matter and why I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity to speak on this stage today. Where does this leave us? I'd like to try and offer something simple. Not easy, but simple. And I hope this isn't too obvious for an audience like you, but this coming week, or next week once you've recovered from the conference, choose one person, someone you think is fine, someone who looks like they've got it all together, and ask them genuinely how they're going. And when they answer, don't just accept the first response, because research shows that people often test the waters before opening up. So stay with them. Sit in the pause, maybe even tolerate a bit of that same discomfort we started with this afternoon, because sometimes the most important conversations happen just after I'm fine. And I'd also like to say something to anyone here who recognises themselves in any of this. For me, over many years, two very simple ideas have helped. Not solved everything, but helped. The first is this. This too shall pass. I've learned slowly and very imperfectly that how I feel isn't fixed, that no feeling is final. Even when it feels stuck, even when I feel stuck, I'm not. It moves. Things move. Maybe not as quickly as I'd like, but it does move. And sometimes that movement is enough to create just a little bit of space. And sometimes, in a little bit of space, is where things can start to shift. And the second is this. I'm not alone. Even when it feels like it, even when I feel like it, even when it looks like everyone else has it all together. And not just in some abstract sense, but that there are people, many people, who understand this experience in ways we just don't often talk about. I'm not the only one who's felt this way, and neither are you. And there are people who care. People who love me, people who love us, if only we let them. When we start to realise or to remember all of this, even just a little bit, something changes. Because connection doesn't have to be perfect to be powerful. And the research supports this connection. Even the belief in connection is one of the strongest protective factors we have. So if you're someone who's struggling, even quietly or especially quietly, you don't have to wait until things are unbearable. In fact, please don't wait until things are unbearable. You don't have to prove how bad it is. We're allowed to speak earlier because things can shift, because people do care, and because change, even small change, is possible. And if you're on the other side of that conversation, as I've said, you don't have to fix everything. You don't need perfect words. Just being there, really being there, can make more of a difference than you might ever know. I'd like to finish with a story I was told by a client I was working with many years ago now. This client's family were immigrants, and his grandfather used to like to tell them all stories of his old life, so they'd know a bit about where they came from and appreciate a bit of their cultural background. Now, my client's family had come from a small rural town where most people, and this is very common back then and where they were from, had small gardens where they grew herbs and vegetables and tended a few livestock. Every weekend they'd have markets where they'd sell or swap excess or unwanted goods for other products that they couldn't or didn't want to grow or farm. I guess it was partly a commercial exercise, but it was also very much a community-building exercise. Now, everyone knew each other pretty well and everyone trusted each other. Well, mostly, I guess it wasn't perfect. So on this one particular weekend, my client's grandfather asked one of his neighbours to deliver some new chickens to replenish his stock. And because, as I just mentioned, there were high levels of social trust, the neighbour did this while everyone was out and while they were down at the markets, safe in the knowledge that he could just leave them out the front of the house. But when my client's grandfather came home, the top had come off the crate. And there were no chickens to be seen anywhere, just a few feathers fluttering around. Now, they were pretty tired. They'd been at the markets all day, but they worked out what had happened and they just knew they had to do what they had to do. So they started to look around, tried to find as many chickens as they could. But when it got dark and they grew even more tired, they called it a day. And then for one last thing, he went round to his neighbour to explain what had happened. He said, "Thanks so much. You didn't secure the lid properly. The chickens all escaped. We've been searching for the last few hours to try to find as many as we could, and we could only find 11. At which point the neighbour grew a strange and surprising smile on his face and said, "Well, that's pretty good. I only delivered 6. Like those chickens, I think I've been lost all of my life. And like my client's grandfather in that story, I've somehow been able to find more in life than I ought to have or ever thought I would. Every day, there are people making their way through life, feeling lost, but still showing up. So perhaps my parting message is a pretty simple one. To look a little bit closer, to listen a little bit longer, and to remind each other, wherever we can, that this will pass and we will find our way. And none of us has to go it alone. Thank you.